Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this postmortem of my Blitz game number 829. My opponent started off with d4, and I went with knight f6, thinking to play a Nimzo Indian or perhaps a Grenfell, depending, but he goes knight f3, which cuts out most of those main lines, so I just go with d5. And here White could go with a London system by bringing the bishop out, or Torre attack with the bishop to g5 there. But he goes with e3, so this looks like it's going to be a Kala system at this point. So I play c5, and then he just takes. If he wanted to play a Kala system, he could play with c3, or if he wanted to call it Zukertort, he could play with b3, but he just takes here. And so this is just a queen's pawn opening. And I go for a queen a5 check to round up the pawn. The chess engine and also the opening book, by the way, likes this move e6, rounding up the pawn with the bishop, after which the line goes like this: c4 and bishop takes c5. So it seems like White just gives the pawn back. Now c4 is not forced. I guess the idea is that other moves that try to hold on to the pawn run into some kind of trouble. I suppose you could meet b4 with a5, but anyway, I haven't ever gone to the trouble of analyzing that. And as long as I can round up the pawn with queen a5, I think this still leads to an okay position. He went bishop d2, and then I took the pawn back. And we are out of the opening book at this point, although this move bishop d2 was still a fine move. So it's not. It's just that the opening book was already down to just a few games, and this move hadn't been played in any of those games. Let's see, but things are about equal here. He goes with knight c3, and I go with knight c6. Knight c3 maybe is a little bit funny because it's covering up the c pawn. It's in the way of the c pawn coming forward to c3 or to c4, which is often an idea White has to gain space and counterattack the center. Black actually has one more pawn in the center in this position, so there may be some edge in that. But he's got White has active pieces. He goes with bishop b5. I unpin immediately. I was a little bit worried about his knight coming into the e5 square, putting pressure on my pinned knight, so immediately unpinning is good. Goes queen e2, defending his bishop and setting up some interesting tactics. So for example, if he were to play knight a4 here, hitting my queen, it would actually take away all the squares of my queen except for d6. If you look at all these other squares, they would be covered by one piece or another. The bishop would be covering that square, and the knight would be covering this square. So my only retreat would be to, my only move for the queen would be to go to d6. So I have to be a little bit cautious here. I went e6, he went a3, maybe waiting to see if I would play bishop d6, which I avoided, but also maybe with the idea of playing b4 later. I'm not sure. Anyway, I went a6. I decided it was time to put the question to that bishop. So he retreated. And now I go bishop d6. Now I have a retreat square for my queen. So if there's any tricks, like maybe he could move this bishop with tempo by exchanging it and then play knight a4. I have to watch out for tricks like that. But in this position, I'm okay because I always have that a7 square. So he moved his bishop back to b3, blocking the b pawn. I castled and he castled. And the chess engine likes Black's position at this point, I think because of the fact that White's pieces are blocking his pawn, so he doesn't have any immediate pawn breaks. My pieces are pretty well centralized, and it thinks I should just keep things static in the center. It likes the move knight to e5, and just allowing this exchange, which does remove a defender from the king side. I don't know, maybe I could get some pressure on the c-file. It's hard for me to say exactly what my plan is here because my usual plans involve pushing my pawns and opening up lines, and maybe the d pawn can come forward here in the right circumstance. That might be interesting. So that's the way the chess engine would play it. So e5 is actually a bit of a mistake. First of all, White has a nice reply in e4, and then I really have to be careful here. So I didn't. I would have had to calculate a little deeper to figure this out, but this all starts with that move e5 and this reply e4. It gets me into trouble. It looks like I'm losing this pawn if I don't take, but if I do take, then he activates his knight here. Just looks good for White. So I'm sort of easing white's development. So I pushed the pawn because I didn't want to lose it. The chess engine says actually it's better to give up the pawn here and go for this somewhat funny looking position with knight d4, knight takes, pawn takes, knight takes, knight takes, pawn takes. And you see that white has emerged a pawn up. He did manage to grab that pawn. But I have these 3 pawns against these 4 pawns. And these pawns have somehow passed each other by, so we both have... Well, actually, this is a passed pawn. This one is at least slowed down by the c pawn there. So white is better here, but the chess engine thinks that it's not so bad for black too. So I guess there's some compensation here. Maybe because his bishop is kind of shut out. So whereas my pieces are all pretty active. Anyway, that was the chess engine's recommendation here. I didn't see that, and I just pushed on with d4, and now knight d5. So it was the combination of these moves. First, that white had that e4 move, and now he has this knight d5 move. And this is pretty much just losing a pawn here. I have to take. Well, do I have to take? I didn't like that he could take here and mess up my my pawn structure. If I retreat the bishop, he can take the bishop, and then I mean, does he get the pawn anyway? I guess I keep on my pawns. I keep my pawns that way, but give up the bishop pair, and it looks like white has an active position there. So I took, and I think that's one of the better moves. And then he takes back with a pawn, and now he's just winning my d-pawn. So all that seemed pretty forced, and just leads to a good position for white. White's basically a pawn up here. Bishop b4, that's a nice move. And then I have to drop my queen back, defending my pieces. And then white's first mistake, I guess, comes here, in that if he took on d6, this is a better position for white than what he got in the game. So this is a way for him to maximize his advantage here. He can grab here now and just go for this endgame. And well, it's the same 3 pawns against 4 pawns, but with the queens off and my bishop, I no longer have the bishop pair, and this bishop is not looking so great. Doesn't have so many good squares to go to. So that's a good position for white. Instead, he took with he took here, and this drags my queen away. And then he took here with the knight. So he's not looking to trade. He's just a pawn up. But I guess I have a little more activity here. Let's see. I went rook to e8 here, hitting his knight. And he went knight to c4. The computer did not flag this as a mistake. So somehow maybe this pawn was going to be a weakness in any case. But I thought it was a little strange that he allowed me to so easily get that pawn back. But as I said, the computer did not count that as a mistake. So interesting play. Anyway, his queen's under fire, so he goes queen to d2. I don't think he had time to play knight to b6. Yeah, I would move my queen hitting his knight, and then he would have to move his queen, so he'd be in trouble after knight b6. So anyway, he moved his queen. Now I have to worry about that knight b6 idea, so I drop my queen back here, and he gets his pawn back. So maybe that's why that move of knight c4 was not a mistake. It's not that his pawn was so weak, it's just that whenever I take his pawn, he can take my pawn, and it all stays. He stays a pawn up here. Anyway, but I have compensation. I have the active pieces for, and I have the bishop pair. So it's not a one-sided position by any means. Let's see. He went queen to f4. He's still okay here, and I went bishop to e6. And it's actually this knight e5 move, which is a pretty natural-looking move. You're just looking to attack the king side, and you can do it with tempo on my queen. That move gets him into trouble, and that's where white goes downhill. Kind of interesting, but you just have to calculate these things out. If he'd gone knight to a5, maybe I would go queen b5 here, and then he could take, and this seems to be good. He's got to rescue his knight here. Maybe he goes back to b3, hitting my back to b3, hitting my bishop. But this position is he's still a pawn up, and it seems to be fine for white. After knight e5, actually, the advantage swings to black, and or at least it's I think it's just even here. But he's given up his edge, And it's because this move queen c7, which seems to solve a lot of problems. First of all, the queen is adding another defender to the f7 square. Secondly, it's pinning that knight. So the knight only has a few squares that it can go to. And, if he does nothing, I will just take off this bishop. Actually, the chess engine recommends knight to d3 here, offering the trade, and then bishop d6 to avoid the trade, and then queen to h4. And that's how he can stay even. So even though he's a pawn down at this point, even though I'm a pawn down at this point, the chess engine thinks I've achieved equality. And it all started with that knight e5 move that led me into the game. Knight e5, queen c7, I'm back to equal. And then when he didn't play knight d3, but he took the bishop, after this I'm suddenly better. So 2 moves, and the game has swung. And they're fairly natural looking moves, but this one I can definitely point out that it helps me activate a piece, and this knight is now under fire. So he could have defended it, I guess, but I can pile up on it with the bishop. So knight d3 is about the best response that he has here. And then I play bishop d6, and at this point he's losing material. So in fact, he's losing the h-pawn. There's no way to save it. I thought, and during the game, I thought he could defend it like this. But, of course, I still have rook to h6, and I'm picking that pawn up anyway. So he went queen g4. Chess engine liked queen f3 a little better, but basically rates these all about the same. And then after I took here, he resigned. Now, the game would have continued bishop here, rook here, to defend the bishop and set up a discovered check, but it turns out there's no gigantic discovered check here. Maybe I can try and pick up a pawn over here or something, but it is a bit awkward for white to play, and the chess engine is giving an advantage of 1.5 pawns, even though the material is even. So there's definitely an edge to black, but it's not necessarily game over at this point. But maybe he was just discouraged about having to play with this king in this awkward spot. And so he just resigned after I played bishop takes h2 check. Anyway, pretty interesting game, I thought. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you again soon.